Yes, a couple times. Well, good evening. Hope everybody's doing well this evening. Couple of announcements to get us going, and several who are on our sick list tonight. Don't forget that next Sunday, or this upcoming Sunday, July the 14th, our older classes will return to their normal classrooms, and we will treat next Sunday as the quarter change, and teachers will rotate as well as children will move up to the new grade or age group. If you have any questions, see Travis Howard. So regarding our education program, thinking about things that Travis is responsible for, we will have a meeting with pizza Sunday night the 21st. Let me make sure I got that date right real quick. Sunday night the 21st to go over all things VBS. So if you helped in VBS as a teacher, as some kind of aide, working with all the activities, be there with us. We're going to try to go over all things VBS while it's fresh on our minds, see what we need to do looking to the next year, and go ahead and get some things planned out. So Sunday night the 21st, we'll have a meeting with pizza to cover all those matters together. Don't forget to turn in your card from Sunday's sermon this upcoming Sunday. If you have it tonight, I'll take it. But Sunday, I'll be looking for those, so turn those in. And then if you are a part of a ties group or a class who is sending mail with the church building's return address, we've had a large number of cards start to come back, and we've finally figured out why this is happening. This is not a problem that you've created, just something that the Postal Service no longer handles by human contact any longer. If you are putting the return address on the back side of the card, you will in the future have to put it on the front. They don't sort their mail by person anymore, and whatever way it goes through the machine, that's where it's going to mail it to. So we've had a number of cards be mailed and come straight back to us because all it saw was that address. So make sure it's on the front of the card, and that will cycle it through the system just in case. So if that's you, not a problem, but something they have recently changed in Nashville regarding that. So they said that would fix that for us, and we won't have those cards returning back to our address, and they'll go to who they belong. We've got a number on our sick this evening. Of course, Cheryl Bennett and Carolyn Hawkins, Sharon Watson, we've been mentioning for some time. Glad all of those are doing better in some regards. Pam Wimberly was with us during our morning class this morning, so she's recovering from her broken arm and surgery, recovering slowly. Pat Johnson is still recovering at home, very slow recovery there. Wanda Wiley was in life care for rehab. She is now home, so we can mark her as home. Vicki Floyd spent a few days in the Cookeville Hospital, and she is now home and doing better. She went home yesterday. Herman Eller still home on hospice care. Want to remember Bob Baker's family. This is Kathy O'Connor's brother-in-law who passed away. And then as well, the family of Bobby Nash. We sent a Findlay flash out Monday on that. And then keep the Dabbs family in your prayers after the passing of Keith Pirtle. Ray Daniels had a heart procedure today. I have not heard about how that went. I'm looking to see. I don't see anyone who sees that, but keep him in your prayers for sure. He had a heart procedure early today. Robert Henry, this is the cousin of Mike Henry, passed away yesterday, so keep the Henry family in your prayers. Kay Sims had knee replacement. I see Dr. Sims is in the house tonight, so that must be going great. Glad she's doing well. And then keep Raynelda Bohannon in your prayers. She kind of scared us this morning. She wasn't at class this morning, and after a couple of folks checked on her, she had spent some time in the ER last night, but she is home. She picked up some kind of viral bug and something of the nature at least, so they have sent her home, but she's still very sick at home, so keep Raynelda in your prayers. Is there anyone else we need to update or someone we need to add to those that are sick? Got it. I almost did that. For those who are working with the Good Samaritan Project this Saturday, we are going to postpone that, and we will get you are we going to do it next? we'll get you a date Sunday. How about that? We'll get you a date Sunday. So if you were helping with the Good Samaritan project on building the ramp, we're going to have to postpone that due to a few little factors, but we will get a date announced Sunday.
Everybody get your songbooks out, and let's turn and mark page 89, I Am Resolved. That will be the song tonight of invitation. Page 89. After you mark that, turn over to page 24, Blessed Assurance. We'll sing the first and last verses. Okay, let's sing. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I am my Savior, and happy and blessed. Watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long.
You pray with me. Father in heaven, we come to you in prayer asking that you be with us tonight as we sing these songs in praise to you, and as we have this Bible study, and ask you to be with Jonathan and the lesson he's prepared for us, and help us to apply it to our lives. And Father, we're so thankful to live in a country where we can gather like this and we're not worried about being harmed. And we ask that you be with the elders and deacons and all of us here at this location, this church, this congregation. We ask that you be with us in all that we do and help us do all things pleasing in your sight. And we ask you forgive us of our wrongs in Jesus' name. Amen.
I have a question for you. It's real simple, but it's hard. Here's the question. Have you ever been wrong? Only a couple of us, I guess. Last night, as Kelly and I went to bed, we were awakened in our sleep. And I said this, maybe it'll stop. It didn't stop. Let me ask you if you ever heard this noise while you're awakened out of your sleep. Then you begin to reason with yourself. I didn't hear that. Maybe it'll stop. If I lay here, maybe somebody else will deal with it. You ever been wrong? 2:02 this morning, the first went off. And I reasoned within myself, well, it'll stop. And you know how that goes, don't you? So I got the stool, with a little stepladder thing, and I took it off the seat. And of course, it's one of those hard ones. You got to pull the wires out of the back of it because it's connected to everything else. Took the battery out of it, laid it on the dresser. Went and put the step stool up. There it goes. So I walk over and I press that little test button, and it finally quit. Now, I could have laid there all night, couldn't I have? It'd have stopped. Never would have stopped, would it? Matter of fact, I guess right now it'd still be going off. I probably could have said somebody else to deal with it. Shouldn't have done that either. Probably could have said, well, I can ignore this. You think I could have ignored it? I don't think I could have either. Sometimes we're wrong. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus is going by the Sea of Galilee in Mark 1:16. And I wonder to myself, were they wrong when they thought what Jesus was telling them, their perception of it? Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Oh, that'll be easy. I wonder how many of them thought that. Oh, that's got to be something I can get somebody else to do. I wonder how many of them thought that. Oh, he doesn't really mean that. I wonder how many thought that. But then we see the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we see the life of Jesus and his ministry. We see the life of the apostles and what they will do inside of ministry, and we start to wonder, do we treat our responsibility in Christ like this? It'll stop. Somebody else will do it. I guess I better. I wonder, Mark 1:16, I'll make you fishers of men. I wonder how many of them thought that'd be easy. Or anybody can do it. Or nobody's going to do it. I wonder what they learned in the ministry of Jesus as he taught them how to become what he called them to do. Maybe one of the things we need to do as we live our lives is contemplate who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. And the truth is, as Christians, we know where the answers lie, but sometimes we just treat it like that smoke alarm. It'll stop. Somebody else will do it. That's not for me. And maybe we need to recognize, like the apostles and the disciples of early, they had to learn that it was their responsibility. And sometimes we do as well. Maybe you're here tonight and you need to follow the Lord. What I mean by that is you need to obey him and become his. The good news is you can do what this book tells you to do, and you can be his. And that'll culminate in baptism. Maybe you're here and you recognize something in your life is like that fire alarm or that smoke alarm, and you're just ignoring it. You know what you need to do, but we don't want to sometimes do what we know we need to do. Maybe it's time for you and I tonight to take care of what we need to do while we still have that time. If you need to become a Christian or make your life right with the Lord, let's stand, sing, and respond accordingly.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free.
Is this where we make the jokes? How many people does it take to change a light bulb? 3 is the answer so far, if anybody else wants to jump in. I know, I was thinking 3.5, 3.5. Yeah.
One holds above and 6 to turn the ladder.
Is this like government work? We'll watch, they'll work. Well, while they're doing that, we'll get through some introductory matters, and maybe it won't be as exciting as it could be. Well, we are in Acts chapter 24. Now, you'll notice in your handout a slight discrepancy. I accidentally put the last 2 points in reverse order, but we're going to go in normal order. We're going to start in Acts 24, and we're going to make our way down through Acts 26 together today in 4 different segments, breaking up chapter 24 in 2, chapter 25 in 1, and then chapter 26 in another. And that will bring us to a conclusion on those matters. Now, upcoming this Sunday, we'll start a new class in the auditorium. Of course, our second adult or other adult class will start back the next week. I just realized he was going to be gone. So we'll start a Bible geography class as we go through. We're developing 12 maps, and we'll talk more about that. And the more I've worked on this, the more I'm excited about how it's going to go. So I'm ready to go for that. And then following this class, we'll have one more Wednesday night in this particular class. And then following that, we will start a class on the book of Revelation. It is scheduled as a 12-week class, but it's looking like a 16-week class. I just don't see it happening in 12. We'll see, we'll find out together how long it's going to take. But there are 12 distinct segments of the class. The first 6 segments of the class, all introduction. The last 6 sessions of the class is the actual class. We need to get through all those introductory matters to get to that particular segment together. And in introductory matters, they've managed to change the light bulb. It takes 3, and that's what we've learned together tonight. Well, yeah, it could be different, okay. I have to tell you, that bothered me all morning during class this morning. Just flickered, and I didn't think about it at all. I turned it off, and it didn't bother me anymore. It gave up real quick. So, Acts 24, that's where we pick up together today. We're going to look at Paul in prison. This is part 2 of this particular segment of our class. Looking at Paul in prison. You'll remember what's been taking place. You'll remember Paul was in the synagogue. Paul was teaching about the necessity of following Christ. And you'll remember in the last segment of this class, they threw Paul out of the synagogue. And what did they do to him after they shut the doors? Remember what they did to Paul? They beat him. Then the centurions and the captains of the army had to come in and deal with the uproar of the city. They took Paul to be in prison or to be in custody. And we find ourselves in Acts chapter 24 where Paul is still in what I call the long custody. We have in Acts chapter 24, looking at verse 1, now after 5 days. So Paul is now dealing with a problem of a long custody, something that as a Roman citizen should have not taken this long, but unfortunately it did take that long. Now I remind you as well, in the previous segments as we studied this class, especially thinking about Acts 23 verse 11, I want you to remind yourself where the Lord told Paul he was going to have to go. Where was Paul going to have to go and be a spokesman for the Lord? Rome. We're made our way back to Jerusalem. That's what started all of this. And you'll remember in verse 11, you've testified for me in Jerusalem, so must you also bear witness at Rome. Here's the beginning of that. And what we're going to see together as we go through is we're going to see the evidence. They're going to bring Paul before another council. We're going to see why Paul was so wrong. They're going to bring an orator in. There's going to be an issue that's going to take place, and we're going to see Paul deal with that. And then we're going to see Paul's appeal and Paul's defense as we bring our class together to a close tonight. But pick up with me in Acts 24. Let's notice the first 21 verses in looking at the evidence. Now, we have verse 1. Now, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator, and these gave evidence to the governor of Paul. So we have in verse 1, here is this man who is an orator. Now, how many of us regularly use the word orator? What's an orator? Speaker, but it's deeper than a speaker, isn't it? What's an orator good at? Orating. Thank you. I was hoping somebody would say that. Orating. What's he good at? He is good, and his profession is to convince the hearers of whatever he is saying, whether it is right or wrong. His job is to take the predefined message and convince you of whatever it is. So I want you to notice Acts 24. Who brings this orator down? The chief for the high priest came down with the elders of the Jews. And they brought someone in to prove that Paul is this man who is no longer worthy of life. That's kind of how they talked about him. He's no longer worthy of living. And they're going to seek him out under Roman rule to see his life come to a close. So we have this orator who comes. Verses 2 through 6, he starts to give his speech. Verse 2, and when he was called upon, this great orator, began his accusation, saying, see that through you we enjoy great peace, and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Here's a man representing the Jewish people. What nation is in rule right now? Rome. Rome's in rule. Roman rule's at play. The first thing they do to accuse Paul is what? Butter up Felix. Now they tell lie number 1 and lie number 2 in verse 2 and verse 3. Lie number 1, we enjoy great peace. Were the Jews enjoying great peace under Roman rule? No. But what do they tell Rome? We love you, Rome. Look at the rest of this prosperity. We accept it always and in all places. Did the Jews accept Roman rule? No. It was an ends to a means to get rid of the one called Jesus. And they thought it would be an end to the means to get rid of the one named Paul. But I want to remind you something. Paul is a Roman citizen. Paul is also a Jew. And what did Paul do before he convinced others about Jesus? Under chief priest authority, he persecuted those of the church. So here we have a man who says, we love Rome. We love all the things that Rome does, and we accept all the things that Rome gives. Is that true? It's not. Read verse 5, or verse 4. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. You know, if you're wanting someone to listen to you in few words, it's probably best not to tell them that you want to tell them about the few words. But that's where they started. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. What law did the Jews follow? What law did the Jews follow? The law of Moses, okay. Under the law of Moses, we talked about this briefly last week, but under the law of Moses, did the law of Moses presume that people were guilty or that they were innocent? Which one? Much like our law, by the way, are we guilty or innocent when accused? Where's the burden of proof? on the accusation, not on the one who is accused. So here's Paul. He's been accused of something. We're going to go tell Rome, and we're going to tell Felix at Rome. We want to follow this matter out based on our law. Have they already followed their law, yes or no? No. What did the Jewish leaders want from Paul? What do they want from Paul? His life. So we bring in this great orator, and it's his job to convince Felix of the guilt of Paul. What has he said that Paul has done that was worthy of death? Nothing. This was their great start. In verses 7 through 9, we see this commander who's been involved in these things, but the commander, Lysias, came down with a great violence, took him out of our hands. By the way, who had already started the mob in the city? Was it the commander or was it the Jews? It was the Jews. So who created the violence? Was it the commander? It wasn't. He took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. Who were his accusers? The chief priests and the elders. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. What accusation had they laid at the feet of Paul of which he was guilty? Have you ever been blind but had your sight? All right, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. You don't have to answer them out loud. Anybody in this room ever been mad? All right, now that we all agree that we've all been mad, has anybody ever been so mad you didn't think straight? Okay, we're not going to admit that out loud, but probably the answer is yes. Here are the Jews. They're so mad at Paul, they forgot to accuse him of something that was worthy of death. They even brought someone in to speak their case, but of what could they say Paul was guilty? Nothing. Nothing. They had nothing of which they could say. And thus verse 10, this is very important to notice. Then, notice this next word, then Paul. So the accusation is now over. The orator has given his reason. His reason was void and dull. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. I won't bring an orator in to try to sway you against them. Because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, neither in the synagogue, nor in the city. Nor can they prove these things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. That's where I want you to stop with me in verse 14. Here is Paul, and he's in this great response to the Jews who said he is guilty. And who is Paul going to start with? The law and the prophets. I beg you to consider something. In the Old Testament, who is the central figure? Sometimes we might think that's Moses. Maybe we might consider in the Old Testament it's Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. But who is the central figure of the Old Testament? It's Christ. Who is the coming one that is coming to seek and to save that which was or was lost? It's Christ. Paul here in this particular scene, he talks about who he was. He talks about what they have been called, the way. Matter of fact, we'll see again in verse 22, Felix is going to talk about the way of being a Christian. He talks about the things which are written in the law and the prophets, and he says, verse 15, I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. What is Paul maintaining as his defense? Paul is maintaining that there is one who is in control. Paul maintains it's not Paul. It is not the Jews. it is not the Romans, but it is Christ who reigns and rules over all things supreme. He talks about the things of which he has done, and how, verse 16, we read these words, "This being so, I myself strive, or always strive, to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now after many years I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with mob nor tumult." He says, I've not had a problem until they threw me out. And the truth is, that is true. Until the Jews turned on Paul, Paul had not had a problem with the Jews. And he says inside of verse 21, there's only one thing of which they can say concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. He maintains the fact that Christ is the one talked about in the law and the prophets, and Christ is the one who is coming back. Throughout the book of Acts, we have seen Peter, we have seen others, and we have seen Paul. And they have maintained one thing that was true. The Christ of which was crucified was the one of the Old Testament. And the Christ of which was crucified is coming back to judge the world one day. What's Paul's lesson about right here in his rebuttal? The Christ of the Old Testament is coming back to judge all in a resurrection one day. I ask you this, of the first 24 verses inside of Acts 24, what had Paul done that was worthy of death? What was the evidence? They didn't have any. The only thing Paul says I can be convicted of is saying there's going to be a resurrection and Christ is going to judge the evil and the good. Which brings us to the big issue. It happens in verses 22 down through verse 27 because we have a weight that's going to take place. Now, Paul has already been taken from city to city. He's already been held captive. He's already had to say he's a Roman citizen. He's already been beaten. There's already been mobs. There's already been problems. Now, after 5 days, verse 1, look at verse 22. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, we're going to come back to that in just a minute, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision in your case. What does Paul have to do again? He's got to wait. Now, Roman rule and also the law in the Old Testament would not hold someone hostage. But what's happening under Roman rule and what's happening, or at least what is wanted by the chief priests, to hold Paul so he could go nowhere else. Now, it just so happens in this occasion, Felix, by the way, we learned about him in the beginning, the governor. By the way, Felix the governor, think about that for just a minute. How high up does this go? Felix the governor is hearing the case. Felix the governor knows about the people who are designated by the phrase, the way. I ask you a question, just one question, and not as a political statement, but as a fact of thought. If we took the governor of the state of Tennessee, would he know about Christians? In the day of Paul and the day of Felix, Felix knew about the people of the way. Interestingly enough, it says, verse 22, he had more accurate knowledge of the way. Christianity was sweeping not only the parts of the Jewish lands, but also all areas of Rome, so much so that Felix knows more, it seems, than the Jews. But the wait continues. He's told in verse 23, or he tells at least, he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty. By the way, if you are in chains, are you free? If you are in prison per se, as in you can't go home, you can't go from here, you can't do anything else, do you have freedom? Give him liberty. What's Felix doing? He's deflecting the problems at hand, just as we've seen in other cases, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or for visit him. So what's Paul got to do? He's been given liberty, which is not really liberty, is it? He's been told he has to wait, but there are no accusers, there is no accusation, and there's no one else to back up the stories, so he's left with the days, verses 24 and 25. After some days, you see a theme with Paul right now? He's just stuck in the days. And he is just waiting, and here soon we're going to move from days into another characteristic of time. When Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning faith in Christ. It seems Felix, who had more knowledge than the Jews of the way, sends for Paul. And he wants to know more. But what do you notice about the wife of Felix? Who is she? She's Jewish. Now let me ask you this. If the wife of the governor, Drusilla, Felix being the governor, is a Jew, and the Jews want Paul dead, do the Jews have an advantage? But what does Felix want to know? He wants to know more information about the way. And thus we read verse 25, and as he reasoned, this is Paul, he reasons about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I'll call for you." I wonder what Felix thought of Christ. I wonder what caused Felix to have the response, "Go away." I don't know what it exactly was, but I know this. The three things that Paul reasoned, now keep in mind that word reason right there inside of verse 25. We're going to come back to that word in just a minute. Were righteousness, self-control, and the judgment. Let's go backwards in order of these to define them out. When you start talking about the judgment to come, who's the judge? Christ is the judge. Who is going to come to call the world into judgment? Christ is going to call the world into judgment. Is Paul going to call the world into judgment? No. Is Felix going to call the world into judgment? Is the chief priest or the elders of the Jews, are they going to call the world into judgment? Is great and mighty Rome going to call the world into judgment? By the way, I want you to notice something. The two groups of people, territorially speaking, the Jews and the Romans, how mighty are their nations now? How mighty are their nations now? How mighty is Israel? How mighty is Rome? As in Rome, who conquered the world but then lost it. We're learning something as we look at the book of Acts. Nations rise and nations fall. But we learn this. Nations that stay with God, do they have a better chance to stay afloat? That tells you and that tells me that being a nation who reverences God should be a priority. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you on the front of that, I don't know how to make that happen, do you? But I do know this. If we are the people we're supposed to be, will people like Felix the governor notice? That's what happened here. The people of the way caught the attention of Felix the governor, so much so that he wanted to know more, and Paul reasoned with him. We'll come back to the word reason in just a minute. So Christ is going to judge the world. Number two, in the middle of this scene, he talks about self-control. Now, how many people could use more self-control? That's kind of like patience, right? We kind of joke and say we won't pray for patience, don't we? Because then we'll have something to have to deal with. But self-control is more than just something in our actions. Where does self-control start? Where does self-control start? Oh, it starts in the mind. The heart is where self-control starts. Self-control moves from our minds to our eyes. Do we need to control our eyes? Do you remember the children's song, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see"? You remember the rest of that? "Oh, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Little feet, where you go. Hands, what you do. Mouth, what you say." Self-control. We now understand that self-control in that small children's song is part about what Paul is talking about. Are there things as a Christian that we should never be involved in? The answer is yes. We're not going to list them tonight, but we understand that's yes. And what does that require of me and of you? Self-control. In other words, if I'm going to be someone of the way, verse 22 and 23, I must have self-control, knowing there's a judgment to come. So a judgment to come, self-control, righteousness. How do we define righteousness? What's the simplest definition of righteousness? Sounds like a real big theological word, doesn't it? What's righteousness? That's right, living the right way. I like to say it this way, right doing. Righteousness is right doing. You know what that tells me? There is wrongdoing. If there is right doing, righteousness, there is also evil. Have you ever noticed there's not a middle ground of that? Now, we want there to be a middle ground, don't we? We try to ride the middle ground. But is there a middle ground? There is either right doing or wrongdoing. There's either righteousness or evil. And that was Paul's message when Felix called him. When his wife was there, she was a Jewish person. There were probably others in the midst. And that was the message of which he gave concerning the way. So much so that it caused him to say, go away, I'll call you back if I feel good about it later. When I have a convenient time, I'll call for you. We can take that one of two ways. Either A, Felix was pricked to the heart, or B, Felix was tired of Paul. I think it's a little bit of both. But there's a word I want you to see inside of verse 25. In these days, as Paul is waiting, he reasoned. He reasoned. If there is ever a word that defines what we should do in this life, it's right here. When others ask us about our faith, what should we do? Reason. Reason. Now we're at gut reaction, we respond. We respond. We tell others what they should do, how they should live, and why they are wrong. What did Paul do? He reasoned. Now certainly, he didn't slide away from the fact that some are wrong. The very idea of righteousness means there is a standard of living. But he reasoned instead of telling everybody else why they were wrong. He reasoned with Felix about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. As all of this is happening, we have the leaving. It's in verses 26 and verse 27. Felix later on calls Paul back to his midst. And what does Felix want of Paul this time? Is it tell me more about the way? That's one of the reasons why I believe that Felix not only was pricked to the heart, but he was also tired of hearing Paul. He was tired of hearing about this way. Verse 26, meanwhile, as he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, the him is Felix, that he would release him, therefore he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But what was Felix wanting? You want to be free, Paul? You want to be free? Give me a tip. Did Paul pay for his freedom? No. Now listen to verse 27. I want you to remember verse 1. Now after days, 5 days, verse 27, but after 2 years. I wonder how many times Felix brought Paul before him. I don't know. But now 2 years have come and 2 years have gone. And Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor. So what did he do for the Jews? By the way, who was his wife? What was her name? Drusilla. Drusilla, that's fun to say, isn't it? And who was she, religiously speaking? Who do you think Felix wanted to do a favor for? Drusilla. Could be the Jews as a whole, but Drusilla, his wife, is a Jew. So what does he do for Paul? As his governorship comes to a close, he could have granted an innocent man freedom. But he doesn't, as a favor to the Jews. What's the issue? The issue is that Paul, both in the Old Testament law and in the Roman law, should have been granted his freedom, but he was not. Sometimes good things or evil things happen to good people with no cause. Which brings us to his appeals. This is in chapter 25. Now, we'll go through chapter 25 rather quickly tonight. He appeals to Caesar, but in verses 1 through 4 there is a warning. Now, when Festus, the new governor, had come to the province, after 3 days he went up to Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest, here's the warning. The high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush in the road to kill him. This is the same idea they had last time. They never got a new idea to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was going there shortly. What was the warning? We want him dead. We want him dead. We want you to do what we want, and that'll make us follow you better. Didn't work. There was a favor given in verses 5 down through verse 12, and we have Festus with Paul. Therefore, he said, those things which I have authority among you, see down with me, and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. What was the favor? You do us, you take care of us, we'll take care of you. In verse 9, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and be judged before me concerning these things? I'll get you back to Jerusalem. I'll make it look like it's the right thing to do. I'll do the Jews a favor. I'll put this to end. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to have been judged. The Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. We went from one governor to another governor, and what's the problem? Same thing. Nothing has changed. So we have judgment before Agrippa in verses 13 through 16. And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. And when they had been there many days, there's the reoccurring theme. It was some days, 5 days, many days, few days, 2 years, many days. Where's Paul this whole time? In chains. In chains. Why was he there? Because he was innocent. Because he was innocent. He says, there's a certain man left by Felix, whom the chief priests and the elders, the Jews, informed me when I was at Jerusalem asking for judgment against them. I answered them, verse 16, it's not the custom of the Romans to deliver a man to destruction before the accused meets the accuser face to face. How many times is this going to have to happen? Well, till Rome is satisfied, till the Jews are satisfied. And thus we have what I call the pomp. It's in verses 17 through 27, the end of the chapter. But we have inside of verse 23, so the next day, here's more days, King Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp. How does a king enter among a room? Does he enter like everybody else? Or does everybody know it when he enters? Great pomp took place. And here is Paul before someone else as he begins to make his appeal. Now he's going to, as you follow this out, he's going to give some things. We have charges against him down to the end, but we have Paul's early life being described in this scene. Verse 1 of chapter 26, then Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Festus has already given in the previous verses why Paul was there, even though he gave no reasons, no special thing. He was waiting on the king to decide what was going to happen to the fate of Paul. In verse 1, so Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. How many times did Paul have to get an orator or a governor or anybody else to speak on his behalf? How many times have the Jews done it? We're now at the highest level of Roman law, the king. Now we have this new man, after 2 years, speaking on behalf of the Jews. He talks about his conversion in verses 2 through 11. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things which I have been accused of the Jews. Well, what is he accused of in the long run of things? being a Christian. The Jews have turned on Paul because he was converted to Christ. What was the great problem with that? Who was Paul before he was, quote unquote, Paul? He was Saul. You'll remember early on in the book of Acts, where did we see Saul early on? Okay, persecuting the church. Where do we see him before he persecutes the church? Think about Stephen. What was Paul doing at the stoning of Stephen? Holding the coats, consenting unto his death. Then we see Saul receive letters from the chief priest. So let me ask you this. Does Paul know how things go among Jewish law and among Jewish conquest among religion? He does. He was taught in their greatest schools by their greatest schoolmasters. And he had it all, per se, when it comes to political rule among Rome and among the Jews. But who did Paul choose? Did he choose the Jews or did he choose Jesus? Which one? And there is the problem. There is the problem. Paul did not choose the Jews. As we see the early life, we see all the things that Paul was doing, how he lived as a Pharisee, how he did these things to follow God, how he had a clear conscience before God of all these things that he was doing, how he compelled men, verse 11, and punished people out of the synagogues, verse 10, how he put people to death. And he was the one, verse 10, who cast his vote against them. Paul says, I know how this goes. I used to do it. You transition down to verse 12. While this occupied, as I journeyed to Damascus. What happened to Saul on the road to Damascus? Well, for the third time in the book of Acts, we're going to find out. But now who is Paul before? The main man in Rome. And Paul now tells of his conversion. But something's going to happen to Paul after he talks about all the things that were done, the blinding light, the conversation of which he had. Verse 15, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, the conversation to whom he had. We have Paul. Verse 19, therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient in the heavenly vision. Who does Paul say he follows? Is Paul following Rome? Is Paul following Jerusalem? Or is Paul following Christ? Which one? Christ. Now, keep that in mind because verse 32, that's going to be important in just a minute. So he talks about all these things that he has done, how he's going to follow Christ. He's not going to follow the Jews, the Jewish people, how he was going to suffer and talk to the Jewish people and the Gentiles. And verse 24, now has he said this in his defense, Festus with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. You know what Festus says? You know what? You're crazy, Paul. You're just crazy. We can't get you on something that you've done wrong, so we'll turn it and we'll just make you insane so that the only option is to put you to death. But look at his response. I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but I speak the words of truth and of reason. For the king before whom I also speak freely knows these things, and I am convinced, or for I am convinced, that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. In other words, all these things that have taken place, especially his conversion, was it done in secret? No. And widely through the region, it's known of what Paul has done in choosing Jesus over the Jews. Verse 27, Paul asks an interesting question, at least I find it interesting. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Why would Paul need King Agrippa to believe the prophets? You remember just a little bit back, what was Paul trying to say? I follow the law. What was coming out of the law? Christ. If you believe the prophets, what comes out of the prophets? Same thing that comes out of the law. Who is Paul making his defense for? Is he making a defense for Paul, or is he making a defense for Christ? That's interesting, at least to me. I know, he says, that you believe. In verse 28, a most interesting passage. It happened previous. You go away for now. It happens now. You almost persuade me to become a Christian. That word almost is big, because it never happened, at least as far as we can tell. So in his defense, he's begging the king to become a Christian. Is that how we would defend ourselves? I find that to be really interesting of this. But I bring you to the very end. All these things happen. He stands up. His wife stands up. The governor stands up. They've gone aside. They're talking among themselves, 30 and 31. This man has done nothing deserving death or chains. But listen to verse 32. Then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Is Paul being set free? No. Now, ultimately, as we've noted in the front of the class, the Lord told Paul he was going to go to Rome. This is probably not the way Paul wanted to go to Rome. But let me ask you this. Are we in control of everything that happens in our lives? Neither was Paul. But who did Paul point others to? Now, if we can figure out how Paul did that, and we can make that application in our lives, what do you think that would do to our faith? And that's where I will leave you for the evening tonight. We'll come back next week, and we will finish the last 2 chapters of the book of Acts. Thank you so much.